The majority of new artificial intelligence data center capacity being built inside China is now provisioned on domestic accelerators. Before October 2022, that share was a rounding error. By mid-2025, it is the dominant pattern in new state-linked and hyperscale-adjacent buildouts. That swing, from near zero to the majority, was not produced by a technology breakthrough that arrived before the restriction did. The restriction arrived first. This script takes two dated readings of one metric, the share of new Chinese artificial intelligence data center buildouts provisioned on domestic silicon rather than Nvidia hardware, and measures what moved between them and why. The then reading is early 2022 before the October 2022 export control round issued by the United States Bureau of Industry and Security. At that point, domestic accelerators, Huawei Ascend foremost among them, were present in Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure in the way a prototype is present in a lab, visible, functional in narrow conditions, and nowhere near the default line item on a procurement sheet. The hyperscale operators running large model training used Nvidia hardware because Nvidia hardware was available, legally deliverable, and benchmarked across the software stacks those operators had already built. Ascend existed in pilot deployments. None of China's three dominant hyperscale cloud operators had publicly qualified an Ascend stack for production artificial intelligence workloads at scale. 0 qualified production stacks. The procurement tenders of that period were written around Nvidia specifications by model number, naming the product the buyer expected to receive. The domestic share of new buildouts was not low in some qualified sense. It was negligible in the way a new entrant without qualified hardware is negligible in any market where the incumbent is available and reliable. That was the baseline. Near zero. Isolated pilots, no hyperscale qualification at scale, no procurement language built around domestic silicon, Nvidia the default. That reading held through the first 3 quarters of 2022. October 2022 is the date the instrument shifted. The United States Bureau of Industry and Security issued controls that removed the Nvidia H100 and A100 series from the addressable supply pool for Chinese buyers, barring export licenses that were not being issued at volume. The logic of the restriction was that constraining the hardware would constrain the capability. What it also did, which was not the stated goal, was remove Nvidia from the legal inventory of a procurement officer writing a multi-year contract. A buyer specifying Nvidia hardware in a tender that would not close for 6 months and would not deploy for 12 to 18 more was specifying hardware whose import license was now uncertain. Uncertain import licenses do not belong in binding contracts. The restriction did not make domestic chips faster. It made Nvidia's delivery date unwritable. A construction firm bidding a 5-year government contract does not specify a material it cannot guarantee will be available at the delivery date. If the highest grade steel carries an uncertain import license, the firm writes the specification around the grade it can actually procure. The building goes up with the steel that shows up. That is the mechanism behind the demand shift. Nvidia became the steel with the uncertain license. Ascend became the steel that shows up. The export control did not change the technical comparison between the two products on the day it was issued. It changed the contracting calculus on the same day. The second export control round in October 2023 tightened the restrictions further, closing workarounds that had allowed some volume of Nvidia hardware to reach Chinese buyers through modified product specifications. The effect on tender language was cumulative. By the time a hyperscale operator's procurement team was writing a major new build specification in 2024, the legal path to Nvidia hardware at volume was narrow enough that writing a tender around it introduced contract performance risk. Domestic first or domestic only accelerator language became the prevailing pattern in state-linked tenders, not because procurement officers preferred it aesthetically, but because it was the only language that did not expose the buyer to delivery failure. The now reading is mid-2025. All 3 of China's dominant hyperscale cloud operators, Alibaba Cloud, Baidu AI Cloud, and Huawei Cloud, have publicly disclosed qualification of the Ascend 910 series for large model training or inference workloads. 3 qualified production stacks. That number matters because qualification is a prerequisite for bidding on state-linked enterprise contracts. A hyperscale operator that cannot provision on domestically qualified hardware cannot bid for the state-linked contract that its growth model depends on. The qualification was not optional, it was the entry ticket. Before October 2022, 0 of the 3 had done it. By mid-2025, all 3 had. 0 to 3. That is the count the export control moved. The procurement tender language moved in parallel. Tenders that in 2021 and early 2022 named Nvidia products directly, specifying the H100 or A100 by model, were replaced by tenders written around performance tiers and domestic first requirements that named no Nvidia product because naming an unavailable product is a specification error. The shift was not symbolic. A tender written around domestic specifications is a tender that domestic suppliers can win and foreign suppliers legally cannot fill. The language change is the demand signal made durable. Beneath both of those shifts, shipment volumes moved. One analyst estimate, from semi-analysis, a single firm figure that should be treated as directional rather than audited, places Huawei Ascend 910B shipments at roughly 800,000 units in 2024. That figure, if directional, places Ascend among the highest volume artificial intelligence accelerators shipped inside China that year. The mechanism behind that volume was not engineering alone. Huawei invested in wafer capacity at SMIC for a 7-nanometer class process node. That investment in capacity requires a demand signal large enough to justify it. The guaranteed demand signal came from the hyperscale qualification wave and the state-linked tender shift. The procurement shift funded the volume. The volume funded the next design generation. That sequence runs in one direction only. The restriction created the guaranteed buyer, and the guaranteed buyer made the supply chain viable. The performance gap between Ascend Silicon and current Nvidia hardware is real and has not closed. In 2022, the Ascend 910A trailed the Nvidia A100 by a wide margin on standard large model benchmarks. By 2024 and into mid-2025, the Ascend 910C had closed some of that distance relative to the H100 on certain training tasks. 2 design generations inside the export control window, with maturation of Huawei's software stack contributing to benchmark improvements that hardware changes alone could not have achieved. The gap narrowed. It did not close. The procurement shift happened before parity was reached. That is the non-obvious reading of the delta. Buyers accepted a performance discount in exchange for supply certainty. When a builder cannot price Nvidia availability into a multi-year contract, the lower-performing chip with a reliable delivery date wins the tender. Supply certainty became more valuable than peak throughput. The restriction did not need to make domestic chips better to move the procurement gauge. It only needed to make the alternative legally uncertain. The first interpretation of that movement is demand creation rather than demand substitution. A buyer that never built at scale on Huawei Silicon did not switch away from Nvidia. It built a net new stack from scratch under conditions that made Nvidia unavailable at volume. The domestic share growing does not mean Nvidia's share falling inside a fixed market. It means a market segment that Nvidia could not legally serve expanded, and domestic suppliers filled the void. The metric measures the growth of an alternative supply chain, not the erosion of an incumbent inside a market both could serve. The second interpretation is that the economics of domestic qualification changed faster than the engineering did. A hyperscale operator that must win state-linked contracts cannot provision on hardware its clients cannot legally use or that procurement rules exclude. That constraint turned Ascend qualification from a hedge, something a cautious procurement officer might pursue as an option, into a prerequisite for contract eligibility. The mechanism is not national sentiment, it is contract eligibility. The buyer qualified domestic silicon because not qualifying it meant not bidding on the contracts that define the growth of that business segment. The third interpretation is the one the source data does not state, but the delta implies. The restriction designed to freeze the install count became the instrument that set its minimum. A guaranteed buyer base plus a hard ceiling on Nvidia supply converted a niche accelerator into the default line item on new build procurement sheets. The wall did not hold the number. It gave the number a floor and let it climb. Now the 3 reasons the delta could mislead. The first is that the install-based numbers underpinning this reading come primarily from vendor disclosures, hyperscale operator press releases, and analyst estimates derived from supply chain checks, not from independent audits of running hardware. Huawei does not publish quarterly accelerator shipment data with the granularity that Nvidia's filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission provide. A buyer announcing Ascend qualification is not the same as a buyer running Ascend at the utilization levels an Nvidia cluster ran. The gap between qualified and deployed at scale is not independently measurable from outside the data center. The second reason is that counting domestic first tender language measures stated intent, not running silicon. A tender written around domestic specifications may award a contract that takes 12 to 18 months to physically deploy. The shift in procurement language leads the shift in actual installed capacity by at least that lag. If the lag is longer than typical due to ascend supply constraints, cooling infrastructure adaptation, or software stack issues at scale, the majority now reading on procurement overstates the majority now reading on running workloads. The third reason is workload equivalence. Even where ascend hardware is physically installed and running, the workload mix may differ from what an equivalent Nvidia cluster would handle. Large frontier model training places different demands on interconnect, memory bandwidth, and software maturity than inference or fine-tuning. Huawei's interconnect fabric and its software stack's maturity on the largest model sizes are not publicly benchmarked against H100 clusters at equivalent scale. A data center that has shifted procurement to domestic silicon for inference and fine-tuning is not the same as one that has demonstrated frontier model training parity. The metric counts the procurement shift. It does not measure workload equivalence. The instrument reads a real and large movement in the procurement gauge. It cannot independently confirm that the running hardware gauge has moved by the same magnitude or that the workloads behind the new build doors are equivalent to what Nvidia silicon would have handled. The delta is real. Its depth is uncertain. Two readings of one metric, near zero provisioning on domestic accelerators before October 2022. The majority of new state-linked and hyperscale adjacent build-outs on domestic silicon by mid-2025. The mechanism that moved the gauge was not a technology breakthrough that arrived before the restriction. It was a supply ceiling that arrived first and turned contract eligibility pressure into demand. Huawei Ascend moved from pilot hardware to the default new build line item because the alternative became legally unreliable before it became technologically inferior. The restriction created the guaranteed buyer. The guaranteed buyer funded the volume. The volume funded the next design generation. That sequence is what the delta measures. The wall did not hold the number at zero. It gave the number a guaranteed floor and let it climb. When the instrument meant to freeze a metric instead sets its minimum, the next reading is not a question of if, only of how far. The next visible signal is the 2025 to 2026 procurement refresh cycle on multi-year framework contracts signed in 2024. Will the domestic first share deepen into the remaining Nvidia-specified segments of Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure? Or will the performance gap on frontier model training hold some portion of new builds back from full domestic provisioning? The tender language on hyperscale training clusters specifically is where to watch. That is where Nvidia's remaining addressable demand in China is concentrated, and where the next dated reading of this metric will land. If you want that reading when the procurement cycle closes, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is when the count moves again.